This podcast is brought to you through support from our partner, the Calliopeia Foundation. Calliopeia envisions a future grounded in compassion, respect, dignity, reverence for nature, and care for each other and the earth. Other organizations they support include the Rocky Mountain Seed Alliance and Lead to Life. To learn more about Calliopeia's mission, visit calliopeia.org.
Welcome to For the Wild podcast. I'm Ayana Young.
We actually understand some critical things that we can do. We don't know everything, and there's lots of things that there's still going to be things that are going to come flying out of the blue and are going to hit us in the back of the head, and that's always going to happen. But we know enough right now to say the most critical things that we can focus on right at the moment. And so let's not let the uncertainty stop us from doing the things that we know will work.
Today we are speaking with Dr. William Laurance. Dr. Laurance is a distinguished research professor and Australian laureate at James Cook University. An environmental scientist, he has written 8 books and over 600 scientific and popular articles. He is a fellow of the Australian Academy of Science and the American Association for the Advancement of Sciences, and former president of the Association for Tropical Biology and Conservation, the Heineken Environment Prize, BBVA Frontiers in Conservation Biology Award, Society for Conservation Biology's Distinguished Service Award, and Royal Zoological Society of London's Outstanding Conservation Achievement Prize. He is director of JCU's Center for Tropical Environmental and Sustainability Science, and founded and directs ALERT, the Alliance of Leading Environmental Researchers and Thinkers, a science advocacy group that reaches 1 to 2 million readers weekly. He is a 4-time winner of Australia's Best Science Writing Award. Thank you so much for joining us today. Your work really speaks for itself.
Oh, well, thank you, Ayana. That was such a nice introduction. I think I feel intimidated to see if I can try to live up to it.
Oh, goodness. Well, Dr. Laurance, many have pointed out that what distinguishes you in the field is the incredible breadth of your work. You've studied habitat fragmentation, soil biology, environmental protection policy, the drivers behind global amphibian decline, carbon storage, and the impacts of climate change and industrial intervention in tropical ecosystems. And that is just to name a few. So, like I said before, thank you so much for taking this time to speak with us on For the Wild on the future of large and ancient trees in the age of the Anthropocene. And it seems actually paradoxical because it would seem that large, ancient, towering trees are often overlooked in the human psyche, especially in comparison to endangered kin such as orca or elephant or rhino. And, when you think about it, big trees, beyond their profound existence, play an incredibly vital ecological role. I'd like to actually read something you wrote from your article, Big Trees in Trouble, How the Mighty Are Falling. Quote, "Large trees sustain countless other species. Their hollows and crevices provide shelter for a myriad animals, and their trunks and branches can become gardens, festooned with ferns, orchids, bromeliads, and other epiphytes, coated with mosses and lichens and draped with vines. With their tall canopies basking in the sun, they capture vast amounts of energy. This allows them to produce massive crops of fruit, flowers, and foliage that sustain much of the animal life in the forest." End quote. I love this passage. It's so just vivid and poetic, and it describes the generosity and importance of large trees who are using their size and their power to care for their community that they're a part of. So I'd really love if you could begin this conversation by expanding on this a little more. How do big trees truly define the architecture of the forest they are found in?
Yeah, well, in many ways, it's the giant trees that most distinguish a particularly unique forest type. Just for example, my wife at the moment is in an area of Borneo, which is one of the last places on the entire island that has never been logged. And so what she's seeing there, and I've been there myself, are trees, massive so-called dipterocarp trees that are 80 to 90 meters tall. So that's basically, as tall as a football field is long. And these trees are just everywhere, and it's incredible. And you don't see those in most places in Southeast Asia because they've been logged out or destroyed as the habitat's been destroyed, cleared, or whatever. So when you see one of these ancient forests that still have these massive trees, I think what you realize is how rare they've become and how, in many ways, the ecosystems that we see and even the forests that we see oftentimes are not really representatives of the grandeur that they once had. And these giants, as we're increasingly realizing, are very vulnerable for a whole range of reasons. The most simplest explanation simply being that they're adapted for ecosystems that are around for a long period of time and are very stable and give them the centuries to millennia that they need in order to attain this, this enormous stature and size. And so in this rapidly changing world we live in, there are a group of organisms like you mentioned the orcas and the large predators and elephants and other species. But they're ones, that are not nearly talked about enough. I think we somehow forget that these stately giant trees are also just as imperiled as a lot of the big animal species that we tend to hear so much about.
Mm-hmm. And really, they go hand in hand. When we're losing the ancient ones on land, we're also, such as the trees, it's the habitat that allows the elephants and even the orcas to survive. So it's really pertinent that we look at whole systems. And I was also wondering, what contributions do big trees make that we're blind to? For example, I think about their production of life-giving water vapors or medicinal aerosols like taxodiomes.
So they do a lot of things and a lot of things uniquely. In some sense, they're a big tree, a giant tree in terms of many things like its carbon storage and it's the water vapor production that you talked about, which is a really important thing that forests do, which of course is cycling huge amounts of water vapor back up into the atmosphere, which is helping to produce clouds. And for instance, in the tropics, those clouds are reflecting a lot of heat back into outer space, which is important for reducing global warming. And they're also really important in terms of maintaining rainfall during the dry times of the year. So when the forests are driest and most vulnerable to fires. They're hugely important in terms of things like carbon storage, the production of water vapor, or so-called evapotranspiration. They're the bread baskets of the forest, the grocery stores of the forest, of course, because they're just really overwhelming in terms of producing giant fruit crops and food crops. In many cases, they're the trees that have the hollows in branches and hollows in their trunks and other structures, which are some of the species in the rainforest or in forest ecosystems absolutely have to have. There's a whole range of different groups of wildlife species that just don't nest or breed in anything except for these tree hollows, oftentimes associated with the largest trees. They're really the dominant, environmentally and ecologically dominant forces in the forest in terms of sort of dominating the nutrient cycles, dominating the water cycles. Again, storing the lion's share of the carbon. If you remove, you can remove in a logging operation, if you remove just the 2 or 3% of the largest trees, you can take out as much as half of the carbon storage that's in the forest, in the above ground carbon storage. And then there's probably, they provide these sort of structural foundations for so many other kinds of plants and organisms. So all the epiphytes and the bromeliads and the vines and the lianas and everything else that sort of live on them. And a lot of these life forms are specialized and only live on trees or on other plant species. So you've got something that essentially is providing the foundation of the forest. And for an experienced, say, an ecologist, that's one of the things that we would be looking at. One of the first things that we'd be looking for when we'd be walking through a forest is looking to see whether or not the big trees are there, because that would tell us immediately whether or not this was, essentially an ancient untouched area of forest, or much more commonly, we would see that there would be an absence of these really giant trees, which means that there's been some kind of selective logging that's happened in the past. The other thing that we can do is, when you're just driving around, if you see these big trees out in pastures, we can take one look at those and we can immediately say, look, that giant tree, either A, has been living there for centuries and the forest around it has been destroyed and the tree's still clinging to survival out there in the middle of this pasture. Or we can look at that same tree and, based on its growth form, we can say, actually, that thing regenerated out there and it's grown over a very long period of time, and it's grown secondarily. So you can actually just look at the structure of the tree and it'll tell you that. So I guess what I'm saying is that the big trees are really indicators of pristine forest conditions, and they're one of the first things that a forest ecologist would look at and look for if they're trying to work out whether or not this is an ancient old growth forest, or whether it's it still might be quite an old forest. It might be a couple of centuries old, but that's not going to be old enough to allow you to regain these really the real giants that would define the old growth forests.
Yes, being amongst old growth forest is like nothing else, and I've just stood among so many of them on different continents, really just feeling frozen in their magnificence. And I mean frozen in the best way, just completely in awe of them. And I'm wondering, why is it that only a small number of tree species have the genetic capacity to grow really big? And then within that, what are the necessary conditions for trees that do have the capacity to achieve giant stature?
Good questions. Well, why is it that only a relatively small fraction of the trees can turn into these giants? Getting really big and really tall turns out to be a pretty tough gig in ecological terms. It's a very challenging lifestyle. One of the really key challenges is the hydraulics. You've got to be able to essentially get water from the ground. And if you're going to grow to, say, 60 or 80 meters in height, which is an enormous tree, if you're going to do that, it turns out to be a real serious ecological challenge in order to get water up to your leaves, up in the canopy. And that's one of the things that we really found out, is that these giant trees are extremely vulnerable to droughts and also to things like habitat fragmentation, which can dry out the forest. We'll talk more about that if you want in a bit. But so the trees that are attaining these giant sizes are really living on the edge in ecological terms. It's a dangerous life in order to try to get that big. Another thing about that big size, as trees get bigger and taller, they actually change their form and their structure, and they tend to get thicker and less flexible. And that also makes them more vulnerable to wind. So you can imagine a giant tree that's going to be, say, in a rainforest, is going to be sticking up well above an emergent tree that would be well above the height of the rest of the forest canopy. Not only does that have to deal with this real stress that comes from dry seasons or droughts, but also if there's a big windstorm, that tree doesn't have a lot of capacity to bend and be flexible in the wind. It's really stiff, so it can be knocked over. And it's kind of counterintuitive. It surprises a lot of people to realize that, well, if these trees are so vulnerable, how did they get that big in the first place? And that's really kind of one of the interesting paradoxes, is that they evidently are able to pull it off, but yet on the other hand, we're seeing that these key factors that really limit their survival when they get large. So, why are not more species doing it? Well, it's just because it requires a capacity the genetic capacity to attain those sizes, to survive, and you have to have all the things that allow you to do that. And it turns out, in fact, when you start looking at this more closely, at details of their physiology, the trees have all kinds of things going on, complicated things with their internal plumbing. For instance, if they get under drought pressure, they tend to do things like block off some of their water vessels. And so this reduces, one of the things that really causes havoc with these big trees is when it gets too dry, they get water bubbles inside their water vessels. And when those bubbles form, essentially the water vessels stop working. So they can't, through siphoning action, they can't get capillary action. They can't get the water up to their tree crowns. So that's what can kill them. So it turns out that trees have a whole variety of different strategies that they're doing to try to counteract the effects of very dry conditions and allow them to survive. But you need to have all the genetic architecture and physiology and the morphology, the capacity to grow and to form those structures in order to get to be those sizes. So it's a pretty specialized creature, and it's not for everybody. So lots of other species are making their lives by being smaller, by growing in the understory, by being pioneer species that would colonize disturbed habitats, by being different growth forms like, vines and epiphytes and lots of other things. So it's just one way of making a living in the forest, but it's one of the more high risk lifestyles. So I think there's just a whole set of challenges that come with being a giant tree, which means there's only a limited number of species that can handle those challenges, and they compete with each other, and they compete with other trees. So there's again, it's a life in the fast lane in some sense, or life in the risky world. And then, sorry, Ayana, could you repeat the second part of the question? Because you asked me something else as well.
Oh, yeah. So I was wondering, but you may have kind of answered this, but I was wondering, the second part of that was, what are the necessary conditions for trees that do have the capacity to achieve giant stature?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it depends where you are, but the bottom line really is long periods of time and very oftentimes environmental stability that allows them to get to be the sizes and the ages that they need. And some of these things, of course, are, once they get to be huge, they can become actually reproductively dominant. They can produce an enormous crops of fruits and flowers and seeds. And so they can become very, very successful once they finally get to be those, to the giant sizes. But then there's a very risky gauntlet that they have to run before they're able to get to be that size. But basically, time and stability, those are the two things that I think one would say are most critical. And I guess a third thing would be the right places, because it turns out, big trees can't just grow everywhere. Oftentimes there's special places in the environment that are suitable for them to have those growing conditions.
Here we go, and I suppose you're never gonna know with likes of me. I can see right through the sides of ships that sail above the seas of green. But I'm considered unfit and I'm not to be believed, 'cause I for one have reached through suns and swam with all the colors bright and shiny hues that move in all directions, ins and outs and in betweens. Now if you saw what I can see, then I would belong and I'd be free. Free from all these chemicals that hide me from worlds that I should see.
You had mentioned the drought and not the drought. I mean, there's major droughts happening all over the world and their effects on trees. And of course, there's also warmer weathers with climate destabilization. And I know that there's a speculation that warming weathers could contribute to the stunting of tree growth. So I'm wondering, how does warmer environment alter a tree's ability to, say, photosynthesize or impact their metabolic rate and even limit their ability for growth?
Yeah, it turns out that it gets a bit complicated, and scientists are still debating some of this stuff. But when we're just talking about warming conditions, one of the ideas that's out there is that with warmer weather, I mean, trees basically essentially behave like a cold-blooded animal, as it were, like a lizard or a frog. When the temperature goes up, their metabolic rate goes up, just like a frog or a lizard would. And when their metabolic rate goes up, they burn more energy just to stay alive, just to exist. And when you burn more energy just to stay alive, that means you've got less energy for growth and reproduction and things like that. So the bottom line is, if you've got with higher temperatures, just everything else being equal, you'd expect trees to grow more slowly. And because you still got trees dying, with slower growth, essentially what that would do would be to over time to stunt the forest. You'd have smaller trees overall. So other things being equal, that's what we would expect. Now, where it gets more complicated is that in the world in which we live in, we're not just changing one thing. There's temperatures are definitely increasing, and things like heat waves seem to be increasing in severity in a lot of places, which can be really important. But we're also seeing rainfall patterns that are changing, and it turns out it's a lot more tricky to try to predict and project future conditions and changes in rainfall and precipitation more generally, including snowfall. And then the other thing that's happening is that the levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere are going up, and plants use CO2 essentially as the fuel for photosynthesis, along with water. So they take CO2 out of the atmosphere, and they take water that they get from the soil, and through the magic of photosynthesis, they turn that into sugars, carbohydrates, and that forms the basis of essentially the food chain that fuels life on Earth. So when there's more CO2 in the atmosphere, it turns out that a number of species, not all, but a number of species can actually use that, and it can fertilize them. So they're so-called CO2 fertilization. So we know, for instance, in experimental chambers, you can set up these growth chambers, and you can't do it for giant trees because it's just the physical reality of trying to set up a growth chamber that would include a massive tree, just not realistic. But people do this for, seedlings and saplings. And what they find is that for some of the species, they grow faster when you elevate the levels of CO2 like we're doing in the modern era. And we've seen, of course, in the last 100 or 200 years, we've seen CO2 levels increase from about 280 parts per million up to well over 400 parts per million now, and not much sign indicating that they're going to slow down. So CO2 levels are going to get a lot higher. So that's another important change, and this is one of the debates that's going on right now among scientists, is whether or not, with the global change that we're seeing right now, whether we would expect this to cause forests to shrink because the trees are growing more slowly, or B, actually cause undisturbed forests. You have to not disturb forests. If they're disturbed, then that changes everything. But for old growth undisturbed forests, the other idea is that because of the CO2, they may actually be growing faster and becoming more massive. And different studies in different parts of the world seem to be coming up with different results. And it's actually quite a hot debate right now in science, where scientists are bashing their heads together and they're trying to figure out what's going on. In places like the Amazon basin, most of the plots there trees do seem to be getting somewhat larger over time. It's not a massive amount, but turns out that on average, when you look at these long-term forest plots that have been studied for many cases 20, 30, 40 years, each hectare, so that's about 2.5 acres, each hectare of forest is gaining about 0.5 ton of carbon, or what would be about 2 tons of carbon dioxide every year. And so what's happening is the forest actually is getting bigger. The undisturbed forests are getting bigger, and if you sort of extrapolate that out to the entire area of the undisturbed forest in the Amazon, what it suggests is that the Amazon could be sucking up about 500 million tons of extra carbon every year. And that's in a world today where we're spewing about 8 billion tons of carbon into the atmosphere. So that's a non-trivial amount that in some sense, so if that idea, if that hypothesis is correct, then what it means is that in some sense the rainforests are kind of trying to save us from ourselves. They're in some sense slowing down or reducing up, to a degree, the accumulation, the rapid accumulation, the escalating accumulation of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, if that's right. Now, the other idea, which is that with warmer conditions, forests may be shrinking, makes a completely different prediction. And what it says is because forests would be shrinking over time, as they shrink, because they're growing more slowly, they would actually be emitting carbon dioxide, not taking it in and storing it, more of it over time. And as they emit more, of course, that contributes more to global warming. And with more global warming, you get hotter conditions. And with hotter conditions, you get slower tree growth, which then means more global warming. And that turns into what we call a positive feedback, or it's like a snowball effect. One thing feeds on the other. And if that hypothesis is correct, it's actually very flat out scary, because it implies whenever you hear positive feedback, you always think danger. Because again, that's like a snowball coming down a mountain and just getting bigger and bigger and turning into an avalanche. So we hope, we very much hope, that the idea that the forest may be stunted by hot conditions is not as important as some people think. It's more optimistic to think that the forest may be getting, some of the forest, the intact forest, if we can keep them intact, may actually be absorbing some of the CO2 that we're spewing into the atmosphere every year, some of that extra CO2. They won't be able to do it forever, because no forest can ever keep growing in size forever. And that's another big question is, well, how long could this go on for? And no one's sure about that either. So look, there's lots of uncertainties, Ayana, when you start looking at the world, and even some really basic questions that we need to understand about the global carbon cycle and how the forests and ecosystems are interacting to influence it, that we just don't know yet. So there's still reasons why there's jobs for ecologists. We still have a lot of questions to try to uncover.
Absolutely. The uncertainty is so, I want to say interesting, but it's not, it is interesting in a just a mental game way, but to see all of the challenges and how in some parts of the world things will happen differently than in other parts of the world. Some areas are going to get wetter, some are going to get drier, some are going to get hotter. There might be colder moments. It's really, like you were saying with the positive feedback loops, we can somewhat predict what we can expect, but at the same time, there's so much that we just don't know how things are going to play out, especially when they compound against one another. And I was thinking about this 2010 study published in Forest Ecology and Management, and it documented there was a significant tree mortality on every continent except Antarctica. And in the last 40 years, and then, for example, trees in the Western US are dying twice as quickly as they did 3 decades ago. But this increase in mortality rates is attributed, generally to heat and drought, which we've been talking about. But then I know you and other members of the scientific community have also noticed this disturbing trend, specifically amongst the global population of large old trees. So it's really this this strange time to be able to take in all this information. And I guess there's a few questions that are coming up with that is, it seems challenging, one, to know exactly what is the driving force behind the disappearance of the old trees. And then, of course, there's going to be these factors that are prohibiting new trees from growing, potentially. And then, so there's kind of this question of, I don't even know if we could even say what is the driving force. But the other part of that question I'm thinking about is, are there any forest types that are immune to, say, drought and heat-induced mortality? Are there, specific latitudes exempt from the loss of large trees?
I don't know the answer to that question. I'm sort of taking this and thinking about it. I've got a feeling the answer to that's probably no, in the sense that whenever we talk about, particularly when we talk about things like heat waves, and I know when you get up into higher latitude forests, I mean, I work mostly in the tropics myself, so that's the system I'm going to know the best. But when you get up into the middle and higher latitudes, in the boreal forests and the vast forests of places like northern Russia and in Siberia and in Canada and northern Europe, heat waves definitely are playing a role in terms of increasing fire risk, for instance, in a lot of those forests. You're getting unusually dry conditions. And then on top of that, we're seeing increased fuel ignition sources because of more human access and more logging activity. So these things tend to interact. So I couldn't off the top of my head pick an ecosystem type. I mean, maybe, I just don't, I've not heard of one, but I'm not sure anybody would have a firm answer to that, but there's nothing would pop into my head in terms of a forest that would be essentially immune to unusual heat events or rising temperature, and especially rising extremes. It's these oftentimes these intense heat waves that are actually becoming more intense that are really scary, because one of the things that we know about living systems, about species, is that there's very often thresholds. It's one of the things we're seeing right now where I live in Cairns, Australia. Temperatures here have just hit in our city here have just hit 103 degrees, 105 degrees, which is very, very hot for here. And when it hits about that range of around 100, 102 degrees, what we see is the fruit bats, the flying foxes, just start dying. And at 98, they're okay. At 100, they're getting really, really stressed. And then at about, a little bit over 100, it's not like you start getting a gradual increase in mortality. It's like they just suddenly all start dying. And we've literally got hundreds and hundreds of them just falling out of the trees and dying. Or the animal carers are over there now trying to save them and trying to, rescue the animals, and they're squirting water into their mouths and trying to rehydrate them and do whatever they can to save some of them. But the bottom line is there's a threshold, and you hit that threshold, and then suddenly mortality kicks in a very big way. And that's pretty much universally true for most of kinds of environmental factors, things like heat and moisture. It's not that you get a gradual increase in mortality as temperature goes up. It's like you get these extreme conditions, and then you suddenly top a threshold, and bang, you get big increases in mortality. And then another thing that you mentioned, which I think is really important to underscore, is exactly that. And it ties right back into this idea of all the uncertainty. What we're living in is a world that is changing in lots of different ways all at once. And that's what we're really seeing. The analogy I would use would be if humanity's in a boxing match with nature, nature's not just getting, a punch here, one punch. It's getting a whole flurry of blows that are arriving all at once. So trees in some areas are being subjected to habitat fragmentation and to selective logging and into surface fires and into invasions of exotic species such as lantana and other things that can come in and completely clog up the forest understory and prevent tree regeneration. There's exotic pathogens and diseases that are killing trees. There's these climatic events that are happening and seem to be, changes in terms of atmospheric chemistry and in weather conditions and climate trends and weather extremes. And there's the synergism, as you say, these sort of, these combined effects. These are the things that really get complicated, and it gets harder and harder to try to predict. I would say that, if we talked about a specific forest type, ecologists would often be able to say something like, look, we think in this habitat type, these are the 2 or 3 or 4 factors that we're most worried about. But then when you get into the details and you say, like, well, exactly how is important, say, this factor versus that factor, or et cetera, that's a much harder question to ask. And, one thing when talking about things like uncertainties, We quote Donald Rumsfeld, which is the former Secretary of Defense under President George W. Bush, and Rumsfeld was sort of given a hard time for this, but he was actually making, I think, a pretty good point, because he was talking about things we know, things we don't know, and then things we don't know we don't know. And it's really that third category which is the most scary. And he was quite right. People were sort of accused him of playing word games. But in fact, this is one of the things that probably frightens environmental scientists the most, is these things that come flying out of the blue and smack us in the back of the head, and we never saw coming at all. And we seem to be having more and more of those happening. And I don't actually think it's because we're learning how the world works better. I think that we actually are seeing more and more of these rare, extreme, or unusual events, or combinations of events, that seem to be knocking ecosystems for a tizzy. And we can give an example or two of that if you want. But the bottom line is, I think the world is just getting more stressed because there's so many different environmental drivers that are increasing over time, and we're just seeing new dynamics happening.
To those who have told you the season's a slave, when the tombs are pried open to reveal all the graves, but their eyes are wide open and thick with the haze that's been flowing through the valleys and up to the skies to make rain. The hills that divide as we wander their longitudes, the clouds that depart do not fly at high altitudes. They stretch out to multitudes and visions of Oban, where the souls that you seek aren't forever together up high.
Yeah, and if projected temperatures rise by 4 degrees Celsius by 2100, that warming alone could quite possibly cause most old trees to die sometime this century. And I was even reading that in California, Costa Rica, Spain, and some of these ancient trees are predicted in these places to disappear within 90 to 180 years. So there's a lot to process. And we can't even process all of it because we just don't know all of it. It's really, it's a challenging time to be in, especially for those of us who really not only emotionally love these places, but also really understand the value of these forests in terms of biodiversity, habitat, oxygen. I think that there is honestly so much value in old growth forest and in the biodiversity that they hold that we really can't quantify. We really can't even understand how to quantify the value that is in these forests. And I know that up until, did you have something?
Yeah, well, I did want to say something, Ayana, because I think that, and we can absolutely run around in circles and possibly with quite good reason, and get very freaked out about all the uncertainties that we're facing. And we simply are. And I don't think that where scientists, I think, sometimes get themselves into trouble is when we try to downplay the uncertainties, because that's just simply not the case. We are facing an awful lot of uncertainties in many different levels. It's not that to me, in fact, the uncertainties are probably more scary than the things that we do know are happening. But that's another question, how comfortable you feel playing dice with the future of the planet. But I would say this: we know enough right now one of the key things we don't want to do is to say, look, we don't know what's happening and we're uncertain about this and uncertain about that. So we're frozen and we stop doing things. And I think that that's exactly the opposite of what we want to do. We know enough right now to say this: the absolute most important thing that we can probably do to give ecosystems the absolute best chance of surviving and to give them the maximum resilience to future climatic changes and to almost every other kind of environmental changes is to conserve large and intact tracts of habitat. That is really important and it's really accurate. So what we want to do is to have the biggest parks and protected areas as we possibly can. We also want to have these protected areas spanning large gradients of environmental change. So for instance, you might have a protected area that starts right at the coastline and then goes all the way up into the mid elevations and right up to the tops of the mountains. That would be an ideal situation in which you would have a lot of topographic variation, a lot of diversity, a lot of different microclimates and microhabitats. And those microclimates and habitats will oftentimes provide really important refuges for some species to survive, say, for instance, when there is an extreme drought event or an extreme fire event or an extreme storm event. So we know enough right now to say this: the best things that we can do, and the other big advantage, by the way, of conserving intact habitats and in conserving the most extensive areas of habitat that we possibly can, is that those lock up a lot of carbon. And we know that right away is going to have a big benefit for reducing the carbon concentrations in the atmosphere. And we also know that these intact tracts of forest are very important, as we talked about earlier, with things like the evapotranspiration, putting all that water vapor up into the atmosphere, which is really important for maintaining clouds and especially crucially, especially in the tropics, during the dry season. And that's when the forests are most stressed and most vulnerable to fire. So the bottom line is this: even though, and we absolutely don't want to say, other efforts to combat climate change, such as trying to reduce emissions from industry and from automobiles and from coal-fired plants and other kinds of things, those aren't important. Of course, those are absolutely critical. But on the other hand, we also want to recognize that there's absolutely critical, positive things that we can do that we know will increase the chances of ecosystems, to give them the absolute best possibility of surviving. And that is to have large, intact, contiguous, connected tracts of protected areas and a habitat. And what that says then, and when you start realizing that that's so important, we start saying things like, it's very important to look at our wilderness areas and our protected areas and the frontier areas in the world where we're seeing all of this expansion of roads and mining projects and hydroelectric dams and other kinds of infrastructure that's just opening up many of the world's last wild areas like a flayed fish. And this is happening in the Amazon and in the Congo and in Borneo and New Guinea. I mean, this tsunami of infrastructure is just exploding onto the world right now. So I think by focusing on the things that we can do, what that also does is it sharpens our perspective about what it is that we really need to combat and to fight. And what we really need to do right now is to fight for wilderness and fight for intact habitats and try to, wherever we possibly can, stop this oftentimes perverse and even in many cases economically and socially marginal and highly risky development that's happening in many parts of the world. So I think that absolutely a critical message for anyone listening to this, to this podcast and this interview would be to say, we actually understand some critical things that we can do. We don't know everything. And there's lots of things that there's still going to be things that are going to come flying out of the blue and are going to hit us in the back of the head, and that's always going to happen. But we know enough right now to say the most critical things that we can focus on right at the moment. And so let's not let the uncertainty stop us from doing the things that we know will work.
Mm-hmm. I couldn't agree more about large conservation, wildlife corridors. I always think about we need to leave space for these ecosystems to evolve. We need to create opportunity for evolution. And when we, pave paradise to put up a parking lot, or when we go in and we mine or log or put up suburbs or whatever it is that we're doing for land use change, then there really is no, quote, hope. There's really no options for any type of survival if we take away the land that actually allows these species to survive. And so I'm with you with all of the uncertainty and gosh, the stress that it creates. Becoming frozen in this time or debilitated isn't going to support the forest or any of the creatures that are a part of that community. So I really appreciate you saying that, and I really couldn't agree more. And this whittling away either by logging or some type of resource extraction or land use change, it reminds me of this article from Nature that you wrote back in November 2018 titled, "If You Can't Build Well, Then Build Nothing at All." And it was this article on the comprehensive impacts of infrastructure on forest communities. And in it you write, quote, "By 2050, Earth could accumulate another 25 million kilometers of paved road. And that's enough to encircle the planet more than 600 times," end quote. So, we've talked about the impacts of infrastructure on biodiversity and on these forest ecosystems. And I'm thinking about, like a second part of that, I'm thinking about how in the same article, you also led me to think about how the global community, at some point should absolutely have the ability to intervene in the development of high-risk projects, especially given that government corruption and private interests are just so pervasive. You give two examples, the first being that the EIA for Brazil's 900-kilometer-long BR-319 highway, which cuts through the center of Amazonia, stated that the project would cause no net increase in deforestation. And the second being how China's Communist Party constitution legally protects and empowers China's Belt and Road Initiative by censoring and even preventing Mandarin translations of any sort of critical response to its proposed infrastructure and extractive industry projects. So my question out of all of this is, what sort of global guidelines do you ideally wish were in place when it comes to whether or not infrastructure projects should go forward? And, what is the role of environmental scientists, botanists, ecologists in overseeing infrastructure development?
Yeah, I really think that the infrastructure tsunami is one of the great understated environmental changes that a lot of people are talking about infrastructure now, but it's a much bigger peril than I think most people realize, because it really is what's responsible for devastating, the last remnants of wild nature. And whether we're talking about an area of wilderness or we're talking about ecosystems that have already been very severely degraded, in which case we're seeing, disruption of some of the last remnants. But it's this incredible expansion of infrastructure and extractive industries, mining, oil and gas development, timber projects, and energy projects. All this together, it's a cyclone of development. I think that scientists need to be a lot more aware of it and need to get a lot more engaged, because I think that the groups, they're mostly public interest groups, such as the environmental groups, and sometimes the social, the indigenous rights groups that are raising concerns and protests about some of these issues. I think scientists as a group could become a lot more involved in this, because these organizations, the public interest groups, really need more expertise. But I think that we're in an incredibly challenging time, and I think the scale of what's happening. Well, if I could do what I would really like to do, of course, was to be able to have essentially a global panel of experts that would look at every individual project and would say, let's look at this in a transparent, open, publicly accessible way and let's try to make some objective decisions about what's going on. That's not really what happens. You mentioned corruption. In many parts of the world, a lot of projects are being approved that should never get approved, not just for environmental reasons, but also for reasons of social risk and financial risk and economic risk, political risk, reputational risks. There's an incredible number of high-risk projects that are financially and in many other ways bad ideas and bad for the developing countries that are being subjected to these projects. And as you said, in the case of China, there's really essentially China ranks among the world's worst countries in terms of media openness. So with the Belt and Road Initiative, which is incredible, the biggest infrastructure venture that the world has ever seen, which China is driving, within China, it's illegal. It's unlawful to publicly criticize that. So that has an enormous chilling effect on any kind of public discussion. There really isn't any kind of public debate. People inside China really just hear positive things about the Belt and Road, and they don't hear about these incredible risks. When we talk about, but here's the thing, and I've been doing this for almost 40 years, working in developing countries in Latin America and in the Asia Pacific region and in Africa and in the Pacific. And one of the things that you find, Ayana, is just nations are absolutely so sensitive to the idea of their sovereignty and them essentially having the freedom and the sovereign right to develop in the way that they want, in their own develop their natural resources in the way that they want. So I think whenever one has these discussions, one firstly has to say we've absolutely got to respect the rights of every nation to determine their own development trajectories. Now, that having been said, because so much of what's going on is happening in the shadows and is happening in dark places and is happening with corruption and is happening with highly uncertain and suspect circumstances. And say, for instance, you mentioned a couple of the environmental impact studies that have been done that are just laughable. And really, we see a lot of environmental studies, assessment analyses that are done that are just coming up with appallingly ridiculous conclusions. I could rattle off example after example of these things. So what we really argue is that the best thing we can possibly do is for scientists and for people that are interested in the environment to try to do all we can to expose people in the countries where all this development is happening. And 90% of the infrastructure projects are happening in developing countries of the world. So most of it's happening in the developing nations, which, by the way, contain virtually all of the world's tropical and subtropical forests, which are the biologically richest real estate on the planet. So anyway, the best thing that we think we can do is to shine a light and to try to have as much information and openness and public discussion and debate about these projects, because what we actually think is if the public can understand what the real realities are, then in many cases, a lot of these projects will die on their own. In fact, we see this, that once you start getting a public debate going, people start to see what's going on. And in many cases, these projects actually die their own death. And what you hope to happen is that process occurs before the nation loses, goes into great debt or squanders away a lot of their natural resources or strands a lot of their assets in some kind of project that ends up faltering. So what you'd really like to see is that smart decisions being made, better decisions being made early on in the development process. What land developers and what the people that are getting wealthy off these decisions and pushing these projects are doing is they're trying to railroad these things through as fast as possible, and they're trying to basically shove these projects through before there's time for public debate and before there's time for a lot of the realities to come to light. And so what we really say is the best thing that we can do is absolutely not to challenge the rights of any individual nation to decide their own development priorities, but there's nothing that's even faintly undemocratic or not right about helping countries and citizens to understand the real risks and realities involved. And when we do that, that definitely improves their capacity to make better and smarter decisions, not just financially and economically and socially, but also environmentally. Turns out those things oftentimes really go hand in hand. So there's a great opportunity right now for people that are interested in infrastructure in particular to try to help groups and nations to understand better the consequences of what's going to happen. Because in a lot of cases, you just get this very simple mantra. And the mantra is this: development is good. And people just accept this without any kind of thinking at all. If development is good, therefore any kind of proposal must be good. And that is such a dangerous way of thinking. That is such a dangerous set of assumptions. And once you start looking in detail at a lot of these projects, you see how precarious many of them are and how disastrously they can fail, and fail at many, many levels. So I think we certainly have our work cut out for us in that regard. And I'm really happy that you brought up the issue of infrastructure again, and let me get on my soapbox again about it, because I really do think that it's one of our great environmental challenges. I think it's right up there with global climate change, because it's, in terms of something happening over the next 2 or 3 decades, this is really the tidal wave. This is the tsunami of change that's happening most rapidly. And in turn, it in fact is driving and worsening a lot of the climate change problems that we're dealing with. So they're really tied in together. And we need good, smart infrastructure and better infrastructure. But boy, oh boy, we need to look at it much more critically than has been done. And we definitely can't assume that all development is good. And we can't assume that environmental impact studies are going to be revealing which studies are good. And we can't assume that good decisions are being made, because the truth is a lot of this stuff is happening in the shadows and the darkness, where a lot of money is changing hands, and where we know that projects are being approved that should never have been approved in the first place.
I'm so happy this is one of your soapboxes. I really feel so aligned with this analysis of infrastructure, and so I really appreciate your passion and your feelings about that. And thank you, Dr. Laurance. This has been such a wonderful conversation. Definitely a topic that I am very invested in and think about every day. So it's been a real joy for me. And thank you so much for your work. And I'd love to stay connected.
Absolutely. Well, I appreciate the interest, and it's been a real pleasure to have the conversation.
Thank you so much for listening to For the Wild podcast. I'm Ayana Young. The music you heard today was from Grant Earl LaValle. I'd like to thank our podcast team, our co-producer and editor Andrew Storrs, our co-producer and writer Francesca Glassbell, our communications director Aaron Wise, our music coordinator Carter Lou McElroy, and our co-managing directors Mara Joy and Melanie Younger. If you haven't rated us on iTunes, please do so. You can also subscribe to us on Spotify. Please sign up for our newsletter at forthewild.world so you can stay in touch. And remember to join our community on Patreon. All right, until next time.